Good evening and welcome to our usual Wednesday night book study here at New Covenant House. We have that every Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And we are studying Christian Anarchism by Alexandre Christoyannopoulos, who wrote it as his doctoral thesis. And we are in chapter 3, which has to do with the state and the church. The description of how the Christian anarchist writers see the state and the church. And we're currently in a section called about the state, and there are 5 points in that. We are tonight going to talk about the 4th point, which is the economic exploitation that the state exerts over its subjects. It does that apparently at 2 levels. Number 1, it is waging war to exploit foreign lands and peoples. And the other is that it protects the wealthy classes domestically. On the international side, the book here doesn't talk about that, but since this book was written, Charles something wrote a book called Unsettling Truth. And in that one, he describes how the church, I think in the 15th century or so, made up a doctrine where it was possible for European nations to conquer other areas and exploit them, and it was perfectly legal to do that. The Christian anarchists say that all states, not just European ones, steal from other nations and then protect their loot behind their cannons and sentinels. And I think we talked about last week about the idea of having armies and wars, and the state would disguise that as peace. They were trying to keep the peace, using arms and weapons to keep peace. And that was the deception of the state, while they were really trying to protect their loot. On the domestic side, it has also to do with this idea of deception. That it claims that it protects the citizens from the worst of human nature, from robbers, criminals, and the like, and demands taxes to provide this service. Yet it thereby behaves precisely like the evil it claims to guard against. So Tolstoy talks about he likens that to the mafia, which will provide protection for you for as long as you pay your dues. So they're saying that if you keep paying, we're not going to attack you. So that's like the state is like a criminal organization, really, in Tolstoy's view. It is said about, similarly, writes Tolstoy, it is said about the right of property that it is established in order to make the worker sure that no one will take from him the produce of his labor. So, again, it has to do with the deception that when a laborer works and produces something, he gets to keep the proceeds from his effort. But that is not true. It always goes to somebody who owns the capital who made that possible. So that whatever is produced is taken away by those who have not produced them. Laws are designed to protect the vulnerable, in effect become the means by which they are further exploited. So prisons and gallows are instruments for the intimidation of the poor to protect the wealth of the rich, who have stolen property from the poor. And the next point is that it's Pentecost. One of the writers talks about ownership of land. When the landowner rents land to a peasant, for example, he will not do any effort, but he will reap the rent from that land. So he says, a taker of ground rent is exactly like a person who compels a starving man to deliver up his bag of gold for a crust of bread. So, in other words, the landowners force tenants to pay way more than it's really worth. Like other Christian anarchists, he is therefore outraged that instead of preventing such widespread injustice, the state arraigns the worker and supports the landlord. So the state is on the side of the landlord in that effort. And then next up is Tolstoy talking about the wage system, which he likens to slavery, because he says there are three causes for wage slavery. First of all, the workers have no land, and second of all, they have to pay taxes to get protection in quotes, and they are tempted and ensnared by the more luxurious habit of city life. Taken together, these factors convince the worker to submit to wage slavery. Thus, Tolstoy concludes, one way or another, the laborer is always in slavery to those who control the taxes, the land, and the articles necessary to satisfy his requirements. And then he gives this example of the post-industrial economic system, unmistakably amounts to a form of slavery. He says that unlike old-fashioned slavery, the boundary between free and slave has kind of become more blurred. And that's a problem because it makes it easier for the haves to hide the fact from the workers that they are in slavery. There is no ownership papers or title document or anything like that, but they are still enslaved to the factory owners. Such economic exploitation is more subtle and more pervasive than direct physical violence, but it is exploitation nonetheless. Indeed, exploitation on a greater scale than was allowed by the more visible slavery of the past. So there may have, when you have wage slavery, you have many more slaves than you had when you had actual slavery. He gives this example of a slave owner. He can send his slave to clean out his cesspool. So let me read it. If the slave owner of our time has not slaved John, So if he has no slave whom he can send to the cesspool to clear out his excrements, he has 5 shillings, of which hundreds of Johns are in such need that the slave owner of our times may choose anyone out of hundreds of Johns and be a benefactor to him by giving him the preference and allowing him, rather than another, to climb down into the cesspool. So the idea that modern-day workers are really slaves because they have no choice but to accept whatever conditions the slave owners, the capitalists are offering to them. Tolstoy, moreover, refuses to accept that this system is natural and unchangeable. And then he goes on to talk about Hegel, apparently a German philosopher. And from what I gather here is that Hegel says that the way the system works is the way it works. It cannot be changed. It's a perfect organism subject to iron laws which regulate the natural division of labor. With each such excuse, Tolstoy comments, we say it is not we who have done all this, it has been done of itself, as children say when they break anything, that it broke itself. But that is not true. So a child will knock over a vase, it will break, and not take responsibility and say it broke itself. And that's the idea of Hegel. He says they cannot be in it. It's impossible to fix this system of exploitation. Tolstoy does accept that maybe some division of labor needs to be, you have to accept that there needs to be some division of labor, but as soon as coercion is involved in it, there is slavery. It amounts to slavery. As soon as the state protects and enforces private ownership of land, this resulting division of labor is not natural but imposed. The division of labor in our modern society is not a result of some eternal and universal law, like Hegel would say, but the reflection of state-sanctioned economic exploitation, that is, wage slavery. Christian anarchists are therefore suspicious of most conventional theories about the economy. These theories tend to be articulated by the more comfortable social classes, predictably exalt the status quo as sacrosanct, if admittedly slightly unfair, and lead to proposed amendments that are not nearly radical enough since they hinge on the preservation of the foundations of this status quo. In the meantime, the economic enslavement of the masses continues undeterred. And we hear that many times that workers of today in the industrial period is really wage slaves. They're slaves to wages. They cannot live without them. And then finally he talks about money. We exchange money for goods, and it's very, very convenient. But it amounts to another instrument of slavery because its functions as wage or as tax are not separable from the violence and coercion which chain modern slaves to their chore. And another one, Morin, is the partner of Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic worker cooperatives. he also condemns usury, which is the idea that when you borrow money from somebody, you pay a rent or interest, usually at a very high rate. But Morin says that this amounts to trying to live on the sweat of somebody else's brow. So in other words, money is yet another tool with which the masses are exploited. And on the subject of money, Jesus says that no one can serve two masters, and when you try to do that, when you choose money over God, then you worship money and you have an idol. And that is going to be the subject of next week's study. The last of the 5 in this little series about the state. I thank you for coming and look forward to seeing you again next week.